Hello there and welcome to The Value of Everything. Michael Acuña is back with me for another dialogue. As you'll hear, we were fairly unplanned before we started this conversation, but it led us down some fairly controversial paths. This episode covers the Holocaust and the precursors to Nazism and Zionism. Also, we look at conspiracy theories in general, mind control, and the potential outbreak of a new civil war. Understandably, these are very sensitive subjects, especially when we come to genocide, which is an absolute evil act. However, there is an overriding message which is within this episode. That is the antidote to a lot of the misunderstanding which leads to the worst sides of humanity. As Edmund Burke put it, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Without clear thought, I'd say we are impotent to act. Now I'm going to pass you over to the conversation between Michael and I. Obviously, you'll notice there's a distinct change in the tone of this introduction to the episode itself. But where it comes to an impromptu talk, there is very little in the sense of where the direction of the dialogue will go, particularly where you have two curious minds batting ideas and thoughts off each other. So now I shall pass you over.
I was a bit busy yesterday. I probably prepared a bit more in the terms of questions, but I didn't really. But I've always got these. Do you ever use Google? I use Google News. It's got like you can map out all the subjects that you like, so you can get rid of all the crap and stuff that you don't really. You're not really interested in celebrity gossip, are you, I guess?
No, I'm not. I like to hone in on political economy and maybe latest science news, that sort of thing, so I can get away from celebrity, pop culture kind of nonsense.
I thought as much. Right, okay. So, all right. I know that you don't like to do this too much, but I've been reading a book recently and it's just sort of, it's taken my mind away a little bit. It's actually based upon actual factual data, but I don't know if you're interested in entertaining this idea too much, but it's about Operation Paperclip. Are you aware of that too much at all? Or
Operation Paperclip was, if I'm recalling the right thing, is it related to maybe
MK Ultra
like
as well.
Project. Oh, MK Ultra. Okay, yeah. No, I was thinking of a different thing altogether related to the Holocaust.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, there's.
Oh, all right.
There's two books actually I've been reading. Actually, I've one book I was reading, like they're both really controversial books actually. So I probably not want to mention the first one too much, but it's about the Holocaust in general and just looking at the facts and seeing what happened there. Now, and the weird thing about that one is that as soon as you just look at the Holocaust in general, and it just mentions this, you instantly become a Holocaust denier. But it's not necessarily a denier. You're just it's called revisionist. Yeah. You're just saying, okay, well, was it 6 million or was it not?
Mm-hmm.
What's the evidence of that and things like that? And people just go, what the hell? Just whack you onto one side and say it's not allowed to even be entertained for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually I've studied a lot of World War II history, and I've actually read a lot of the so-called revisionist historians. So I read David Irving, for instance.
Yeah.
And the second you should ever inquire as to what the facts of that historical episode are, people think that you are, being disrespectful of the victims, that you're anti-Semitic, that, but you're basically treading on grounds that are taboo. So, and it's really just a matter of intellectual inquiry. It's not a matter of, harboring these horrible views that you get.
Yeah, I've got I probably like way distant relatives that are Jewish immigrants, but it's nothing really just like what we're talking of here. But my great was like a Jew or something like that. But so, I mean, like, it's not like I'm anti-Semite. And there's all these weird things. Like, as soon as you mention the word anti-Semite, I don't know why there's a particular word for that sort of thing as well. And then the next thing is that you what happens to these people is even more shocking, because they get imprisoned as well for a lot of them. Well, I don't know exactly the full ins and outs, but some of them seem to be banned from going to different countries. Some of them just seem to, like, I don't know what happens with the law, but there seems to be a lot more pressure on these kind of people that do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, in Europe in particular, since they don't have constitutional guarantees of freedom of speech in a lot of these countries, Austria, Germany, and Poland, if you hold views that are considered verboten, such as just honest inquiry into the facts surrounding the human rights violations during World War II, you can be imprisoned. Just if you say, okay, there weren't 6 million Jewish victims, there were probably 3 million. That alone is grounds for being imprisoned in some of those countries. And it's really unacceptable from my perspective.
I'm thinking to myself, like, what the hell is all this about? I mean, it actually just leads me to more inquiry, really, than anything else.
Of course.
Which I mean, if it is a cover up, or if there is any motive behind it, is a bit, I don't know, it's a bit strange in a way almost.
I honestly think part of it has to do with the politics of today, especially when it comes to Israel. A lot of their self-justification for claiming to be a nation state stems from the Holocaust narrative. So if anything should undermine it or call into question some of the atrocities, then it jeopardizes public support for Israeli nationhood. And I think that is one of the factors surrounding this.
Yeah, and then I was looking into actually, like, have you heard of the Balfour? I don't think it's the Declaration. Yeah. So and that happens for the creation of Israel, and it was the British government having an agreement with the Rothschilds as well. I know you instantly sound like a conspiracy theorist as soon as you mention this, but it's not. There is actually information there to prove that this is
this isn't something that we don't have actual accepted documents that would, verify that these agreements were entered into. It's not some sort of, we heard this from classified sources or anything like that. But the fact that you're labeled a conspiracy theorist just for bringing these up in conversation is rather telling.
Yeah, and if you think of that treaty that happened, the Balfour Treaty, like that just, or was it a treaty or an agreement? I can't remember what it was called anyway. But that has just changed the face of world politics almost, hasn't it? And it's like you can't even begin to describe, like, out of all the things that have ever all the declarations that have ever been created. Obviously, you could say like the Versailles Treaty and things like that might have had influences of what happened in World War II, but like this one and the implications of what's happening today, it's profound, isn't it? And like, I guess you wasn't taught that at school, was you?
No, not at all. All of this I sort of learned on my own whilst researching, because when I first got into college, I was interested in majoring in history, and I really gravitated towards contemporary European history. So say the 19th century onward. And a lot of this took place around that time. And I just started delving into a bunch of different historians and different events of import during that time. And so I came across a lot of this on my own. I certainly wasn't exposed to it in high school, and even in the college materials, they mention it, but they don't really delve that far into it.
Yeah, I mean, you just need to just mention it and then just say, okay, well, this is what happened in the creation of the Jewish state. You could even, if you really want to, I mean, it sounds controversial to say this, but you could even say to sympathise with the Nazis' position, the reason why they became anti-Semitic was the fact that basically there was, obviously the Rothschilds, a Jewish family, created this agreement, and as a consequence of this, there isn't really much connection, but there is obviously media articles out there. The media swung very dramatically in America to be very anti the Hun, and there's pictures of like this monkey, and you can look at all this stuff. And all of a sudden, then from a perspective of the Nazi Germans, like that First World War, that was going to be a loggerhead. There wasn't really going to be much going to happen from that one, and probably the British would have retreated if America never entered into that war. But instead, the whole thing swung around. America got in, and you had the advent of there was tractors turning into tanks, and then you had and then there was the ability to get around trench warfare after that, and then the military supremacy of America and the industrial power smashed Germany in the end. But the ill resentment of the fact that potentially things were happening in the background that swung the media to get America to go be anti. And America was always never get involved in war, wasn't it? The Constitution almost says never kick off a foreign war.
Yeah, the foreign policy of the United States has sort of oscillated between geopolitical interventionism and then isolationism. At that point in time, usually the population is always opposed to entering into these sort of foreign engagements. If there's not real noticeable American stake in these sort of affairs, then people are not going to be supportive of it. So it takes a lot to sort of galvanize the public and to favor these sort of military engagements. But in World War I, in most of the United States, people were not really that eager to get involved. It was really a European matter. So, I mean, I know that, and this is going to be controversial, but you mentioned the Rothschilds.
Yep.
If you look at the history of finance capital in general, and I learned a lot of this on my own, but also Karl Marx had written some really good analysis of finance and its political.
Incidentally, wasn't he Jewish as well? I know that he converted or something, didn't he? Yeah.
He was Jewish by ethnicity, but he was raised as a secular German within a nominally Protestant household. So his father had converted to Protestantism, so that way he wouldn't have to worry about their Jewish background causing problems in terms of employment or their social standing. But Marx had written an entire paper, it might constitute a book if you wanted to be sort of pedantic about it. But he wrote a book called On the Jewish Question, where he was analyzing, and people accuse him of being an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew and all of that. But what he was really trying to analyze was the Jewish place in Europe at that time, why anti-Semitism was a phenomena, and how to overcome both of these things. But when it came to analyzing finance capital, most of those articles were written when he was a journalist publishing in the New York Tribune.
Right. And
a lot of Marxists don't know anything about these articles, but he was basically saying that, if you follow the history of Jews in Europe, they were sort of pushed into finance because they legally weren't allowed to engage in any other forms of labor at the time.
Yeah.
Finance was unpopular, tax collecting. The monarch sort of used Jews to go into those roles. Christians weren't allowed to engage in usurious lending. They had a lot of sanctions against that, especially in the Catholic Church. But Jews were permitted to do that. And so they sort of were pushed into those occupations, and they developed hegemony in them. And as finance became more pivotal in economic affairs, they exercise political power as well by virtue of that. So, they influenced how nations formulated their foreign policy here and there. I mean, there are other factors as well, but that was one of them.
I'll tell you another interesting thing that I remember once. Do you ever look at those quotes of people in the past and see what they say? There's websites that do that, and I actually just scroll through them and just listen to them and see if anything resonates with me. But one person actually I do like is Henry Ford, and I was like, yeah, that's brilliant. There's actually one where it's just all of his quotes, and they're just like, boom. And honestly, you read them out. If we just sat down and then read out a couple of them, you think, my God, this guy, he's a Marxist. He must be. It's like, it's honestly, it's like you think, my God, what is he saying here? And then I was at a party. I was having a barbecue party with people the other day. Maybe a few months ago, and somebody said, "Oh, he's a Nazi, though." And I went, "What?" And he was like, "Yeah, he's a Nazi sympathizer." And I was like, "Really?" And then I looked into it. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of this? There was a very controversial book called The Elders of Zion or something like that. And then he did his own personal investigation based upon that to see if that theory was backed up. I just take it as a pinch of salt because it does you talk about opening a rabbit hole. That book, that Elders of Zion, is like, I can't even imagine that a person even speaks like that or would speak like that or somebody of power. I mean, maybe it's a different time, but I can't even imagine that if that was the case, that there was a complete megalomaniacal counter-culture or secret society that was like that. And then, but then, I mean, I haven't got the time to bloody investigate everything, but it's just, well, obviously, you know why Henry Ford didn't like that, because he had Jewish finances. I understand his motivation to be that way anyway, but, and he wanted to be debt-free and didn't want to be at the will of other people, but...
Even within the capitalist class, especially at the early time of industrialization, there was a lot of discontent and a lot of conflict between industrial capitalists, people that were producing or distributing commodities, and finance. Yeah. And were sort of at loggerheads for a long time. And since finance did disproportionately feature Jewish actors that were involved, a lot of industrialists like Henry Ford or the Krupp family in Germany, they started entertaining these sort of notions, anti-Semitic notions. They supported political parties that were anti-Semitic. I actually read the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion many years ago. Yeah, and I started investigating it because some of it just seemed just beyond the pale, like the extent to which
I can't imagine a person would almost be like that, somebody would be I don't know, you're literally you're dehumanizing people to such an extent that I mean, obviously, you could say the Nazis did that as well in a sense, but it just doesn't sound real to me in that sense. But maybe I don't know. It's weird, isn't it?
It is, and it was kind of gratuitously anti-Gentile. I know that there were Jewish intellectuals and religious figures that did speak in similar terms about non-Jewish people. There was a lot of ethnocentrism in the Jewish community, but it was some of the specific claims that just seemed infeasible to me. So there's a couple of passages where they're talking about Jewish involvement in some of the political and scientific emerging fields. So they mention Marxism. They mention
yes, yeah.
They mention they mention some philosophical strains of thought. They mention Nietzsche, and then they mention Darwin. And all of those are claimed to have been orchestrated by Jewish agents acting at behest of these elders. And I was like, that just doesn't, prima facie, that doesn't seem plausible. I've read Nietzsche, I'm a Darwinist. I can't think that this was just invented to fulfill Jewish objectives. And furthermore, Marxism in particular, as I said, Karl Marx was not a Jewish chauvinist by any means. In fact, people accuse him of being anti-Jewish all the time. and with some textual justification. So I was like, okay, this seems a little far-fetched. So I researched it, and I think to this day, no one can really say who wrote it, but
somebody very clever though. Like, I mean, for all the information that they knew in there and things like that.
Oh yeah,
he was like, "What the hell?" Yeah,
I don't doubt that some of it may have come from actual Zionist sources, but I think it was edited and put together in such a way as to foment anti-Jewish sentiments in Europe. But it emerged in Russia during the Czarist period.
Maybe you could say it's potentially even like state sponsored as well, because there's a lot of it's not, that's, I mean, unless somebody's just been in the library for half their life, somebody writing that out is like, I don't think is possible really, almost.
Yeah, it certainly wouldn't have been circulated if that was a legitimate document. I really think that it was state sponsored, and it was either entirely written by or at least edited by people that were working with the Tsarist regime at that time. But, I mean, ignoring the actual source of it, it is interesting because of what it precipitated across Europe. The protocols were used in Germany after the First World War.
Yeah.
They had really wide political implications. I actually mentioned a lot of this. I wrote a paper about a year or 2 years ago now on this conspiracy theory. You may have come across it, where you hear the term cultural Marxism. Right. And I wrote a really long paper because for years I've been hearing this from certain of the fringe elements on the right. So some of the alt-right people and white nationalists and fascists, they always use this cultural Marxist meme. It's this conspiracy theory that Jewish Marxists are trying to undermine Western culture so they can usher in a period of authoritarian communism with Jewish people at the head of this oppressive regime. So I investigated all of these claims, and I knew the sources for it, and I sort of go back historically and trace where some of this came from. And so I go over the protocols, I go over the specific claims they make.
Did you see anything about Henry Ford's investigation? Because apparently he paid for a load of private investigators to look into it and stuff.
Yeah,
and then he did news articles. He did like a weekly news article almost or something about it.
He even went so far as to publish, I don't know if he published the protocols or if it was
called something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was from Martin Luther. He had written a bunch of articles on Jewish involvement in European politics far earlier than the protocols. Yeah. And he started, when he sold the Ford, it would come with the car, this book for people to read. So I did look into Ford's involvement and investigations into the veracity of a lot of these claims. But, there was a lot of limitations at the time in terms of attesting the veracity of a lot of these.
Yeah. You could say, okay, well, he's an industrialist, so he might have had quite an empirical mind and done something like that. But also he was at the whim of the finances as well. So he had motive to be against them in a way as well. So you can't just be so like he's not just like a innocent bystander in the whole picture of putting the information together.
He definitely had a material interest in trying to prove these claims. But as you said, he was still an intelligent individual. He had a scientifically orientated mind.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he, more than a lot of these ideological anti-Semites, would have gone about it in a more reasonable way. But again, it's very, he had limitations before him. And I sort of, personally, I lean towards the notion that a lot of these claims are exaggerated and they were designed in such a way. And then Martin Luther, he was a Protestant. He was a major figure in the Protestant Reformation, obviously. Yeah. He had religious objections to Judaism already. So he also had an interest in trying to portray Jews in as negative a manner as possible. But someone like Karl Marx, he was Jewish ethnically, but he understood their role in terms of finance, capital, and the history of Jewish involvement in European politics. So he was analyzing it from a rather different perspective. And I find a lot of his work compelling, but I think that it's sort of a non-starter to enter into discussions about contemporary Zionism by mentioning these historical facts, because people are just shut down automatically. I like it just in terms of intellectual cultivation. I like to research these things.
Just in terms of just seeking the truth and stuff like that. You look at it, like, obviously history is always, history's going to always been written by the winner. So they're going to tell whatever propaganda they want to, and you can almost say that we live in fascism today, couldn't you? So in a weird way, even though, because it's the corporations that almost have the power of the politicians, which is pretty much fascism in itself. So you say, okay, well, the Second World War was a war against fascism. However, we're in fascism, so something weird's going on here, and like.
I don't think capitalism has ever really lived up to its professed ideals of liberalism. Like, I think that's the ideology that surrounds capitalism, but it's never been faithful to liberal tenets of free inquiry, freedom of speech and expression. It's always sort of, if not explicitly, denied those sort of things. And we see that, as we mentioned earlier, in Europe. They're still arresting people for holding the wrong views on certain things. In the United States, they don't go that far, but you can be shut down from the public stage. You're going to have restricted access. You're going to be villainized.
You work for a corporation and you start talking about this stuff. I don't think that you got much of a lifespan, have you?
No, you certainly don't. That's the power of the media. And Noam Chomsky, actually, he's written a lot about freedom of speech and how capitalism sort of marginalizes views that it finds inconvenient. And I think that his model, there's a lot of truth to his model of capitalist repression of thought and speech.
Yeah. Well, I think just one thing, like if you and I were just having this conversation in any corporation or any place in the world, like, what would be the reaction straight away of you mentioning that? Hysteria, wouldn't it? Hysteria straight away. Like, what are you talking about? Like it'll be just instantly, just bang, straight to the, like, what? Like, how could you be so, like, how can you mention that? Almost like you're some kind of weirdo or something as soon as you mention something like this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're like, oh, yeah, actually, I've read about this. Then it's like, I think this is good just to put out there, just to see that everything doesn't necessarily need to be just like, what the hell, complete hysteria, and that's crazy. It's just like, okay, well, this is a line of inquiry that I'm taking. It's taken me to these points. I'm not totally convinced yet, but I've got this information, and I know that these people have got these motives, and these people have got these motives. But I sort of I have to just weigh up everything, and I can't really make a conclusion at the moment. But it's just I would definitely agree to a certain cultural conditioning which occurs. Where do you think that actually happens? Do you think that's happening in just media, or is it like the family, or is it the school, or where do you think that person that turns around and goes, "What are you talking about?" Like, where is that coming from? Is it them, or is it something else?
No, I mean, I think that we're conditioned from an early age to hold a number of assumptions and not to transgress against them. So, and I don't know if it's like there's different sources behind it. So obviously, respect for private property, that we know where that comes from. That comes from class power, and that comes from the bourgeoisie exerting its own philosophical justification onto society. Those are sort of necessary assumptions just to maintain functionality. When it comes to things such as what we were just discussing, Zionism, the facts surrounding World War II and the First World War, those come from special interests that include, I think it's difficult to separate economic power from cultural capital or, minority power. I think they're closely intertwined. But, there's not a homogeneous line of thought within the ruling class of society. That's why we see differences of opinion between, in the United States case, Democrats and Republicans. Like, that's the spectrum of acceptable thought. And, there can be rather vigorous disagreements between those two lines of thought, but they're still narrow parameters. They're still upholding the same assumptions. They just disagree on some of the finer points. But that reflects the range of the ruling class's ideology. So they're not of a uniform opinion, but they agree where it matters. And then you have, like we mentioned, Jewish involvement in finance capital.
Yeah.
That's a very... If finance wasn't as hegemonic as it is right now in the economy, then we wouldn't have the same, censorship when it comes to World War II or when it comes to inquiry surrounding Zionism.
Yeah.
As we see today. So there's a close connection between economic power and special interest groups.
Yeah, I also put it down to just like education, because obviously at the lower levels, which like everybody's going to just come into the, but not even the lower levels, just like the mainstream of people haven't necessarily been given too much in skills of how to make a line of inquiry, how to seek the truth, how to be reasoned, and how to not, let's just say, have an argument or have a debate. Nobody's really been taught that at school. It's never even a subject matter really that you go into, even though it's probably one of the most important things. Maybe you get taught the scientific method, but not even that really to a greater extent.
No, so we're not. Yeah. I was just going to say, we're not really taught or encouraged to critically think.
That's it.
We're taught to accept the prevailing notions, and that's taught to us in these public schools, and the public schools curriculum are shaped by the society at large, which has certain views and assumptions that it wants the population to hold and not really subject to any critical scrutiny.
Yeah, and then you think, okay, well, the families, probably a lot of families still like act in like punishments and things like that. So it literally just goes like, if you have an argument and the family structured it this way, boom, punishment straight away, then you realise that open inquiries and things like that doesn't necessarily happen. Fortunately, like I had a father who enjoyed these kind of things and discussions, and that sort of probably had an effect on me. But you have that kind of thing that's happening, and then once you go up to the intellectual classes and you go to the people that really do make decisions on society and write white papers, they won't entertain somebody who is of a position that is in, let's say, the lower class or the mainstream, because they're not part of the academia, and therefore it's just not like, you go down to the principle of just like ignore them or don't even entertain them or laugh at them, and then there isn't any crosshatch of any discussions really, other than two people that go on the internet with each other or something like that. Really, it's really strange.
It really is. And I think all of what you had mentioned, all of these phenomena, they're mutually reinforcing, and they all demonstrate this range of acceptable thought. Like in academia, you're allowed to hold different views on, say, a certain historical episode, but they can never fall outside of certain boundaries of acceptability. They have their own sources that they consider sacrosanct, and then, like I had mentioned, David Irving, who's one of the foremost historians on the Third Reich, and even people who adamantly did, because personally he's probably a fascist, if not a sympathizer,
right,
of the Nazis. But his work is impeccable because he goes to primary sources. he's done more first-hand work than a lot of historians who are just recycling the work of previous scholars. And if you actually look into the methodology he employs, it's hard to take exception with it. Yeah. But yet he's not regarded as one of the foremost scholars on the Third Reich. He's regarded as a crackpot, and he's marginalized and villainized. And, I understand if you don't like someone personally, but, that's just going the ad hominem route. You have to engage with his research. You can't just say, well, the guy is he's a fascist. Well, that doesn't have any bearing on the veracity of his claims.
Yeah, well, call me a weirdo, but if somebody comes out with like a very strange thing to say, I'm very interested in it. Really, I'm not necessarily like, well, that's stupid. Like, what are you talking about? Like, there's no. I'm just like, okay, well, tell me more, please. How did you get to this point? Like, well, just to explain to your thought pattern. I mean, maybe I'm speaking to a madman, but I'm just interested in how your line of inquiry happened there, and right. If you can break down the certain parts and the steps of how you got there, then I'll be interested in it, and I'll entertain the whole entire theory for you if needs be. But that doesn't happen anymore, does it?
No, it doesn't. Not at all. And I'm of a similar disposition. If I hear something that sounds really out there, I'm immediately curious as to how they arrived at that conclusion. And as I mentioned in the past, when we were talking about entertaining different paradigms of political economy, I'm always fascinated by following the logic behind arguments and to see whether or not I can make sense of it and whether or not it seems accurate to me. So when I hear if I come across someone who sounds rather unusual, I'm immediately going to try to figure out why they sound that way to me.
Yeah, and obviously if it's got me any benefit, because last night I was just on YouTube, and I don't know how, but I just got into some probably like, I felt like it was almost like clickbait, but it was like the flat Earth stuff.
Oh yeah.
It was actually just just showing loads of pictures, and I think I had my audio off at the time. And I was just like picture after picture after picture, and I was looking at it. I was going, okay, well maybe like there's something going on here, but like I was just thinking, even if it is a flat Earth, what information do I seem to gain here? I don't really get what I'm sort of like. Even if we are sitting on a flat Earth, like it's and there's a great conspiracy behind it. I mean, it really ain't going to change much other than just the fact that, I mean, I don't know, unless we are living in some kind of like big simulation and there's this godly power and that changes the whole dynamics of religion. But even, I don't mean, like, it's such a strange thing in itself. Like your day-to-day businesses and runnings and things like that isn't really going to change dramatically from this. So it's just like,
Right. If it was proven that we're living on a flat Earth, there's really no practical consequences that follow as far as you and I or most people are concerned.
Religion is the only thing that I can think changes. But other than that, there's not really much I can't see that's going to happen.
And furthermore, most of the major religions in the world have made their peace with the notion of a round Earth. Like they don't... It's not that crucial to their own self-justification. They can assimilate the round Earth. They can assimilate evolution by natural selection sometimes, depending on the specific religion. I mean, they can sort of assimilate all of these scientific findings and still find a way to have their religion seem plausible to people.
It's not like the problem I get to is that the time that I would require to actually invest into looking at this, getting all the information, getting the facts, getting the big picture and understanding what the consequences of everything is, and then coming to some kind of decision based upon all of the facts. I'm trying to like become a scientist, and it's too much time. I don't have the time to go.
It is. Yeah. Life is short. We can't. There's only so much we can do.
And then you think to yourself, like some like flat earthers have just committed their entire life to proving something, and then maybe it's not right. I don't know. And you've committed 20 years of your life. I mean, like,
it's awful. And I mean, there's a certain mind that gravitates towards that sort of thing, where they commit themselves so fully to these rather asinine ideas. That's the same reason why people join cults.
Yeah.
Some of them will commit suicide just because someone told them to. I can't understand the psychology behind people like that.
Yeah, I've been reading a book recently about MK Ultra and Operation Paperclip. So this is where you bring over the Nazis, and it was more the propaganda machine as well.
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting in itself. Let's just this line of inquiry. Do you believe that you can hypnotize somebody?
That's a good question, and it's funny that you should mention that you've been reading about MK Ultra and Operation Paperclip. I actually had been researching MK Ultra for the first time about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
I had heard about it in the past, and I never really looked that far into it, but I was, for whatever reason, it came to mind and I was intrigued. So I was looking into it, and from the research I had done, I'm still not convinced that hypnosis is actually possible. There are some people that swear that it can be done.
Yeah.
I know that the government is very interested in that possibility, and I've looked into more contemporary claims since the MK Ultra project ended. If you look at what DARPA, the Department of Defense budget in the United States, has been investing in, they're very curious about methods of controlling people's thoughts and behavior by remote. And there's new methods that they're not standard hypnosis, but gene editing, psychological interventions that sort of transcend the old hypnosis notion.
Well, just from my position, I can sort of accept that propaganda exists in the world, and you can condition somebody to be a certain way. So I'm very aware that I've got a son, and I can very easily condition him to be a certain way or manner. I can make him violent. I can make him peaceful. There's a lot of things that you can manipulate somebody, particularly when the mind is quite young as well. And then as time progresses, if you've conditioned somebody from a young age and to think certain ways, and do not have critical thinking to think for yourself, but to let me do the talking for you, then I think you can really get somebody into a certain way of thinking. And I would say that's a mild form of hypnosis. Mm-hmm. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it would depend on how one defines hypnosis.
Yes.
I see the term, I generally am thinking of a
total loss of what you are and stuff. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking of that scenario where you have the hypnotist and then the patient, and that I don't know if that's really feasible. But I do agree that propaganda exists. I think that humans are malleable at a young age. Epigenetics is a new paradigm that is there's more and more evidence coming forth every year that shows how you can impact someone's general behavior at an early age through various environmental stimuli.
Yeah.
So that's all true. I have but whether I would go so far as to call it hypnosis, I don't know. Again, it's just a matter of how the term's being used.
Yeah. So this is my understanding. I'm not an expert in hypnosis itself either, but the way I understand it, I actually mentioned it to somebody at work actually the other day, and somebody says, yeah, actually I got hypnotized myself actually. Now, certain people are more susceptible to hypnosis than others, and it's actually people that make quick decisions, which is I found quite interesting really. I guess I would hope I'm fairly slow at making decisions, but yeah. Basically, you know those, have you seen those things where there's like, you go to a pub and somebody's a hypnosis on stage and he does all these funny things to people?
Yeah.
So basically what happened when I spoke to this person at work, and I don't think that he had anything to say that was disingenuous to me. He's quite an honest guy, and he's a nice guy and stuff. And you could tell that he's the kind of person who'll put his hand up to something like this and go along with the fun and stuff. But he said, yeah, I took away, and this person who's hypnotizing people took people into this other room, And then he did I don't know, maybe like this, whether he did the clock or the spinning like swirl thing or anything like that. But a lot of people went into deep sleeps, and he literally had to go wake up, and then he said, this is not workable. But some people went into a trance where there was a little bit more of a subconsciousness which was going on. So, I mean, have you ever woken up and you're not quite there? It's like your mind isn't, you're in this kind of strange subconsciousness. Have you ever found yourself in that position? So incidentally, actually, I find that my best thoughts are at that time when I'm trying to do podcast shows. I just wake up and I go, okay, I need to think of something this morning. And it's actually at that time when I'm in that subconscious state that I can actually think of ideas and what to go down. But that's a side note anyway. But it's in that position there that there's an ability to tell people what to do, and if that person's a trustworthy voice and a hypnotizing voice, then that person can be put under. Now, what he did say as well is that he was totally aware of what was going on. It wasn't necessarily like it was a different person. There was all these funny things that happened to him as well while he was doing this. He just he was told to go back to his family, but then in the background beforehand he said, when you hear this music, you're going to stand up, and he got another man to do this with him, and then you could run across the room and then do a dance with each other. And then he was just talking to his wife, and his wife said to him, when this music played, it's just literally your eyes glazed over and you stood up and then just ran across the room at full pelt and then started to dance with the other person in the room and stuff like that. So, I mean, it almost sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? You're just like, what the hell? How is this possible? But then once you think to yourself, okay, there's some consciousness, there's certain people that are different levels of susceptibility. Now, on a side note to this, when we look at these projects and stuff like that, people, when I was looking into this, there was people saying that there is hypnosis, but there's different levels of hypnosis. You can use drugs, you can use torture, you can use, and you're aware of Stockholm syndrome as well. Yeah. So where basically the person who's incarcerating you or torturing you actually become attached to. You feel like you want to look after them or something like that. So there is mild forms which I can accept to a certain degree, and I can accept that Stockholm syndrome can exist as well. But then once you try it's like a real harsh version of propaganda with drugging and with torture as well. If you can get somebody into a subliminal state and then really push them with these little levels of the mind going from consciousness to deep sleep, then there's a certain level of programming which can happen. And I'm happy to entertain that theory anyway. Yeah,
I think that that's definitely a possibility. I think that when you look over the results, the documents related to MK Ultra projects, there was some evidence that was compiled that would suggest that. But I think that overall the project failed at being able to fully remotely control people in the manner that they had hoped they could initially. The mind is just, it was too vexing, and they were able to plant certain ideas and to influence behavior to a minor extent, but it didn't yield the results they were hoping for. Yeah. Where you could just take a person and have them think and behave exactly how you wanted them to.
So, yeah, I mean, the inquiries that like a book that I was reading and stuff is saying that people were actually coming back from military service and they were working in supplies or something, but then they were finding that they couldn't sleep properly, and then they would have certain therapy, and little parts of their mind was coming back to them and recollection. But there was parts upon parts of it's like compartmentalization of the mind, and different parts were open, some parts weren't, and then there's other things like, they almost created apparently they said there was multi-personalities that they created in people as well. And the major point I'm trying to get to here is that the fact that if you could have anything of incredible power is if you had somebody that had the ability to control somebody who is of a position of power in a hypnotized state. So that will be the ultimate sense of power, because you've got a front man that you can not just gently control, but purely control, and then you've got the ability for them to carry out your actions.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's, well, I don't know, from your perspective, but that would seem like the scariest type of power, because then you don't have there isn't any political throwback from anything, really, is there? Because nobody has, like even if like you've lost the person's consciousness and things like that, because they're a soldier for the person. Exactly.
You eliminate their subjectivity entirely.
Yeah, and like this is like, I mean, now we're like, rather than just going at like data points and stuff like that, this is where my mind is wandering as well. Are you following the political debates and stuff recently?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Hilary Clinton and things like that. And do you ever look at the Alex Jones show as well, or are you aware of that?
I actually watch Alex Jones periodically for entertainment purposes, and the thing that's that people may find unusual is that I actively listen to and read a lot of the conspiracy theorists that I personally regard as being way out there.
Yeah.
Because I like to see how they take certain undeniable facts like MK Ultra or the Gulf of Tonkin, and things that we know happen historically.
Yeah.
And I like to see how they take those instances and they sort of frame them in such a way to lend their particular views credibility.
Yeah.
So I do listen to Alex Jones every so often. I'm really familiar with his work.
Actually, just incidentally, right? Can I just take your views on like massive conspiracy? I know. I remember one of the podcasts beforehand. You don't like to entertain these things too much, but there is reasonable like truth in these lines of inquiry anyway.
Yeah.
The assassinations of JFK and was it
Robert Kennedy?
Yeah. Wouldn't you say that why was it just one person? Why one lone person who didn't have any political connections or anything like that, but have had connections with the CIA and stuff like that? It's so, if you think of a puzzle piece that could fit very closely into mind control, that part could connect quite well.
Right. Yeah. The Lee Harvey Oswald JFK assassination, I always found it seemed...
And it's the same time as those projects were going on as well.
That's right. Yeah. And Oswald in particular, he had such a intriguing past that if they had that sort of technology and the means by which to manipulate someone, he would be someone they would have taken for sure, because he was in the military, he had CIA connections. He would be someone who you could assume would be affiliated with projects of that sort. The problem with the JFK conspiracy, I sort of gravitate towards the view that it was a CIA operation. Right. And the reason I think that is because there were CIA operatives that had been killed and imprisoned during the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Kennedy sort of half-heartedly went into that, and then he pulled out at the last minute. So the CIA hated Kennedy for that in particular.
Right.
But then there's these people who romanticize JFK himself. They think he was this radical who was really changing things, and they needed to take him out because he was too dangerous to the status.
He did that famous speech about the military-industrial complex, didn't he?
That was Dwight D. Eisenhower, actually.
Oh, it wasn't? Oh, jeez. Okay.
Yeah.
Why do I think it was him?
He had similar speeches, though. It wasn't famous. The things he had spoken about, I think, were secret societies and
secret societies,
things like that.
We find them abhorrent and stuff, wasn't it? That speech,
right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, he made remarks like that sort of stood outside the mainstream. But if you look at the policies he actually supported during his administration, they were very similar to every president that preceded and succeeded him. He wasn't, even though he said radical remarks here and there, he wasn't some agent of change that a lot of liberals like to present him as. And Noam Chomsky actually, back in the 1970s or 80s, he had gone on a rather long exchange with a lot of JFK conspiracy theorists. And I was persuaded by Chomsky's analysis. But still, to this day, I think that the plausibility of a CIA plot against Kennedy is reasonable. I think that might be, I don't believe the official narrative that Oswald was... Yeah, he was a communist and he hated JFK because he was, a capitalist president. It just, I don't know, it seemed too flimsy of a narrative for me. I mean, that may well have been the case, but I don't know. I really don't know.
Okay, so obviously I do a podcast which is all about thought experiments, but the thought experiments could be quite easily connected for conspiracy theorists almost as well. Hopefully I'm trying to put things in a fairly well-grounded manner, but the one thing that I'm conscious about now, and it's becoming more relevant as time goes on, is that things like the Alex Jones show and other articles are going down the line that Donald Trump, that the voting system is going to be rigged. It's going to be the people that are counting the votes and all this kind of stuff is causing problems. I mean, are you acutely aware of this issue? Because you almost have... I'm really sensationalizing this when I say this, but you're almost having a situation of where if there is so much discontent and you've got the Second Amendment people, you could almost, in a weird way, you could say that there's a real strange split in America between almost white nationalists, lower class people, and the welfare class plus elite class almost. It's really strange, isn't it? And that's multicultural at the same time. So you're getting this really strange split, and you're having this powder keg of people that have arms, and that could almost be some wicked amounts of social unrest to something even worse, couldn't it? Almost, if there was this mainstream of news articles that were going out, particularly from things like the Alex Jones show and things like that, to say that there was actual vote rigging, which I'm sure does exist. I can't probably deny that probably doesn't exist, but if people start to think that they've been robbed of something, wouldn't that have a massive impact on American culture and what would happen in current affairs?
Part of me thinks it would, but then as I've been analyzing this election cycle, and we see evidence from WikiLeaks where we have Hilary Clinton and the DNC emails coming out in these massive data dumps. And we see all of the fraud and manipulation the Democratic Party has been involved in, including the possible assassination of the whistleblower who made these documents public.
Yeah.
All of this information is out there. And yet nobody's really reacting that harshly. It's not really affecting the opinion polls. I think that people are so apathetic right now and that they don't care. And I think a lot of people assume all of this stuff is happening anyway, and they just feel powerless. Okay, yeah, this is happening. We know these sort of underhanded things.
Trust in the media is something shocking at the moment. It's 2% or something that trust the media.
Right. Mm-hmm. Media. And that's and also just general faith in the political establishment's at an all-time low. People have a healthy distrust of politicians, and they always have.
The strange thing is that really the media is it's almost like it's the most important company entity, because it has to stick to the facts and has line inquiries and does the due diligence and stuff to make sure that the population doesn't go down the rabbit hole. Yet people are going to listen to, maybe a few people might listen to what we say, and people might listen to Alex Jones and then take that as the truth, which is crazy, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. I mean, the fact that the media, it's come to the point where people doubt anything that's being said on the news or published in a newspaper. Now they're looking for alternative sources of information, and not all of them are any better than the mainstream media. I think that Alex Jones, for instance, has his own self-serving narrative, and he's made a small fortune sort of
apparently he has a CIA connection as well, like his family's CIA. Yeah.
I mean, I would believe it, and furthermore, he's calling out everyone as being involved in some conspiracy, and then there's other conspiracy theorists that say he's involved in a Zionist conspiracy or in
yeah.
Like it gets so out of hand, nobody knows who's doing what anymore, and they have their own interest as well. They're not these objective truth tellers. I think that they're spinning things in a way that serve their interests, especially when you start commercializing your operation like Alex Jones has, where he's selling supplements. And, it's become an actual an enterprise for him at this point.
Because I think, like, I can't remember what the quote was or anything like that, but I remember, like, the best way to control people is to create the hero for them, and then people will believe in them more than anything else.
Right, exactly.
And if you could think of a better created hero than Donald Trump for some people, like, it's incredible, isn't it, almost?
It really is. I think that you had mentioned earlier how there's this potential incendiary environment in the United States where we have these multicultural, liberal, bourgeois elitists on the one hand, and then sort of dispossessed, resentful, white nationalists, lower class on the other end. I think that people that are feeling disempowered right now, they project their hopes onto Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He's someone who just plays to an audience. He knows how to get people, and that's why you see him flip-flopping on issues all the time. It depends on what he feels the crowd is interested in hearing. So if he feels that he's in a more liberal environment, he'll sort of pivot to the left when he's questioned about things.
You can tell he's an intelligent guy. You know how he's playing the crowd, yeah.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that he's probably a mediocre intellect, but he's not as inept as a lot of people try to present him to be.
You can tell. You can tell he's using very simple language in the way that he speaks, and
it works.
Yeah, it definitely works.
He's posturing as a savior for all of these divergent class interests. So white working class people, they think that he's going to sort of restrict the labor supply by building the wall.
He's going to get their jobs back as well. He's going to say, "I'm going to get your jobs back."
He's going to bring back all these good manufacturing jobs, and they're going to restore communities and public works projects and all these things. So they feel like he's offering that. And Obama did the same thing when he was running for election. He positioned himself in a way that people were able to project their hopes onto him. It was a different segment of the population, but nonetheless, it was the same phenomena. But in the end, returning to election fraud, I know that it's technically possible. We have these voting machines, and a lot of people have come public that program these things and have stated that you can, hack them.
I've heard that actually all the actual people that actually come out with the announcement is a news organization network. So all you need to do is just literally control that and then come to the announcement to all the news networks. Then it doesn't really matter how the count goes. Right,
exactly. Now, when it comes to whether they do it in the presidential election between Hillary and Trump, I don't know. I feel part of me thinks that the people who matter in society, the mega capitalist interests, they know at the end of the day, either candidate is going to fulfill their interests. I don't believe that the state apparatus is this autonomous entity where politicians go in and they can make decisions that are at odds with the economic power in society. I think that they realize that both Clinton and Trump at the end of the day are going to serve their interests. They might employ different rhetoric. They might favor some segment of capital over another, but ultimately the differences between them are going to be minimal. Yeah. So there's no need to rig the election when you have a political system that's as controlled as the one in the United States is.
Yes, one of the other questions I wanted to raise on here as well, obviously America's got a history of civil war, for example. If there's one area that you would want to kick off and annoy more than anything else to create a civil war, which segment or culture of society would you go after?
I mean, I think that the Civil War itself, the American Civil War, that was really a war that was both about the economic development of the country and also an ideological war about the place of slavery in that development. I think that there was a fundamental incompatibility between America as a slave-based agrarian society and as an industrializing capitalist society.
Yeah.
And that was sort of inevitable. So it was a struggle between two competing modes of production for the future of America. I don't think it was necessarily about segments of the population per se. I think that each side recruited their own segments through various ideological propaganda notions. But overall, it was playing out in terms of economic development and competing interests. In the contemporary context, I don't know. I mean, I think that the changing demographics of the country are sort of fractionalizing along the lines of an aging white working class population whose standard of living is progressively declining as a consequence of the state of capitalism right now. And then an emergent primarily Mexican immigrant population situated in the western United States. Yeah. When it comes to the issue of immigration and border controls, that's something where you might find some friction, but I don't know how far that can go right now.
So, did you mention that you're involved in the study of revolution? Is that right, or am I mistaken? Okay, so yeah, so I think this is probably a very interesting part to actually just cover with you. Actually, in the terms of, could you sense that there's like I remember the London riots, for example. I was over in Australia at the time, but I knew that sort of thing could have happened quite easily. Like how quickly things can descend into anarchy as soon as even 50 people get together and does something and create unrest. The police are overwhelmed pretty much instantly, and they have to call in areas and all that kind of stuff. So as soon as you get a rioting and people start to loot in different sections of town, there's literally just there's no way of controlling the situation, and it is almost like the civilians need to rise up at that point to prevent this from happening. How would you say that, like, we're going towards this point now where potentially there is very disenchanted, like the white working class, the Second Amendment people that are pretty pissed off with how society is going? I can't really see anything redeemable from Hillary Clinton's side, really, to be honest. It just seems to be like, I can't think of, I mean, like, I can see redeemable features from like both characters on most times when I've seen politics. Trump seems to be like, he's like hitting a lot of buttons in comparison to Hillary Clinton, which, like, I really don't see what she's doing. I can't see how she's connecting with the people at all.
She really isn't. I think that most of her support right now is just people who are reacting against sort of Donald Trump's excesses.
Yeah.
So you have people, she gets support amongst older women voters, minority voters, because she's sort of a continuation of the status quo.
Yeah.
So whoever is doing relatively well right now, support her. And also the minority groups who feel threatened by any Republican in terms of welfare state minimizations or anything that would interfere with those sort of transfers of income from one group to another. Those people will support any Democratic politician. They don't really connect with Clinton on any other level, but they just don't want things to be transformed in any way.
Okay.
They're happy with the way things are.
So, like, with your knowledge in like revolution, and obviously you're a citizen of America, I imagine. with the situation, let's do this thought experiment. Let's just say that going into the polls, Donald Trump, there's a lot of evidence to indicate that he's going to have a unanimous win. And then the polls come through, and then it's announced that Hillary Clinton is the new president. What can you see here? Is there any particular situation where you could see that there will be a lot of unrest amongst like the Second Amendment group or anything like that? Or would it be just like acceptance and just get along with it? How would you read the situation?
I think that the reaction it would elicit would be outrage amongst a very small segment of the population. So when Trump mentioned the Second Amendment types,
yeah,
I mean, most Americans support the right to bear arms. That's just a part of our culture stemming from our history with constitutionalism. Most of us including myself, think that that's a legitimate law that we can have the freedom to exercise. But the people that are sort of fanatics about that, they tend to be the militia sort or the staunch right-wing Tea Party demographic
communities.
Yeah, and they're really, numerically speaking, insignificant. They aren't going to precipitate a civil war or even much unrest. They might have some protest in response if they really think that the election was stolen in this hypothetical scenario. But I don't think they're going to put themselves out there in terms of risking their lives over the outcome of this election.
How about the military? Because the military is like a weird thing, isn't it? It's like if you ever want to work out what a nation's all about, always look at their military. You can get a lot of information as to what kind of country they are. But and America tells you. Looking at America's military tells you a lot. But obviously, the president is the ruler of the what's the word where they're the ruler of the
commander-in-chief.
Commander-in-chief, yeah, of the military. However, like Donald Trump is very much so with like military in a certain sense, isn't he? Because he's very pro-veterans. Obviously, if you think of anything about power, the government is force in itself, and he's very sided with the police, he's very sided with the military, he's very sided with the CIA, the FBI. He could really ruffle the feathers of the controlling class almost.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the distinctions between Trump and Clinton in terms of the military in particular, I think Trump, he does do more in terms of rhetorically supporting veterans and sort of promoting a stronger national defense. But if you look at his foreign policy perspective versus Clinton, she has an extensive history of supporting military interventions in the Middle East in particular. You see it while she's been Secretary of State under Obama. She's been instrumental in sort of the military engagements we've been involved in. So the military-industrial complex and the higher echelons of the military, the generals, the chiefs of staff, they understand that under Clinton, they're still going to be exercising a lot of influence in terms of American military engagement.
They're still going to be employed, aren't they?
Yeah, they're going to be employed. They're going to have a lot of power. They're going to matter, in other words. Trump, since he's sort of, on the one hand, he has said that he favors some military intervention. On another hand, he's sort of a dove, as it were, when it comes to Eastern Europe and Russia. And he's gestured that he doesn't really support American foreign policy where we're in favor of regime change wherever and whenever possible.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that plays well amongst certain elements, but in terms of, the people in the military who exercise a lot of authority, I don't think they react too well to that.
So we're actually like highlighting a split here, aren't we? We've got let's just say the military class, if you could say the military class establishment, and the corporate military industrial complex, which probably would be Hillary Clinton. But then you've got like the grassroots military, like the military families and the people that like patriots, for example, who would probably side with Donald Trump.
Yeah, they would. But there is also another facet to that that's interesting to examine. So within the lower ranking military personnel who would like Donald Trump, if you start cutting back on military intervention abroad, necessarily you're going to have redundancies in terms of how large your military apparatus is, the personnel. And what happens is whenever we sort of withdraw from a certain engagement, you see people being cut from the military. And then the communities that were being supported by military bases and by transfers of payment from military personnel to the community buying goods and services and whatnot, those communities are progressively immiserated. And so it's complicated. I don't doubt for a moment that the lower level military personnel support Trump right now. But if he were to hypothetically become president and then let's say he implemented an America first foreign policy, something like that, something that's more isolationist, and then you get a cutback in terms of how many troops you need, that support might dwindle as a consequence.
The way that I understand Donald Trump's policy just on the aggressor side of things is that he said he will knock the hell out of ISIS and he wants to renegotiate the rules of having foreign bases and making other nation states like Japan pay their way for military support. And he also makes suggestions of renewing all of American military hardware rather than purchasing loads of pointless things which really help out certain business owners that have paid off politicians to buy this military equipment. He wants to focus the attention on getting the right pieces of equipment for the right job, for the right environment that we're in today, maybe counter-terrorism, things like that. So I think a lot of those policies are pushing the military into a bigger thing rather than a smaller thing, in my opinion. But obviously in actually kicking off wars, I don't think, I think you're right as well. I don't think Donald Trump wants to, he's happy for for people to fight amongst themselves and apply the old rule of divide and conquer.
Right. I mean, from what I can gather based upon his comments, and mind you, Trump, whenever he's questioned about foreign policy, he really answers with rather vague responses. He'll mention a couple of slogans here and there. It's nothing that substantive. So I don't know how invested he is in any of these notions. But having said that, I think what his policy, from what I can gather, would amount to is, like you said, there would be investment in the military. He would try to target that investment towards more rational projects. But there would be a cutback in terms of our presence abroad. And even though he'd be investing in the military, the sheer number of soldiers you'd need without wars abroad, the demand would reduce considerably. So he may be investing in the military and building a stronger military, according to his logic, but it would be a smaller military. And that's where we start seeing some of the economic consequences come into play. Smaller in terms of troop size, not in terms of projects that we're investing in.
Also, I know that you know a little bit about the Constitution as well. Is there a part in which you can say there's a time that you can kick out the government? Because I know there's a standing militia and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff was to kick out the government. Is there anything specific there where it says if the democracy has failed? I know it's not even really meant to be a democracy, it's meant to be like a constitutional republic, but if the voting has failed, is there a thing that you can kick off in terms of the Constitution?
There's not a specific clause that says that, you can legally overthrow the government, but it's sort of implicit that if the government fails, every politician, every president has to swear upon their inauguration to uphold the Constitution.
Yeah.
So if they start deliberately violating that oath in terms of just ignoring the articles and the separation of powers that are enumerated in the Constitution, it's implicit that it would be legitimate to maybe not overthrow the government entirely, but replace the officials that are violating the articles of the Constitution.
Because Donald Trump's pretty flippant when he mentions things like the voting is rigged, Second Amendment guys and stuff like that. He's very good with his rhetoric to swing things in directions that potentially could mean violent things, but not. And I mean, I don't know, he's a master manipulator in a way, isn't he? He gains masses of people and they all chant USA and they're all wrapped up in this sort of, we could say mind control almost in a way. So, I mean, just a character like that with an economy that we've got, going into a situation where your people are saying voting's rigged. I mean, you can probably say more so than I say if you've got a divided country or not. You're saying that maybe it's more on it's not quite as big scale as what people think it is. But then if you look at the power situations and the things like that and the words and the rhetoric and I don't know, it's a funny situation I would say America's going into right now. And I just, the way I look at it is like everyone just thinks in just mainstream politics of just going, oh, it's the Punch and Judy show and this, that and the other. The way of my thinking and the thing that attracts me to things is the sinister things of looking at a situation and a picture. And I'm trying to think a few steps ahead here. And I'm thinking, oh, this point is going to turn a bit nasty if we go down this route. I can see it really going a bit weird after a while.
Right. I know exactly where you're coming from. And you would think that given how incendiary the rhetoric coming out of Trump's campaign is and the events that are surrounding this election, you would think that if in a scenario where people assume there was voter fraud happening.
Sorry to interrupt you there. And we haven't even mentioned terrorism as well. So you throw in another 9/11, or you're going to get something very weird happening.
Right, yeah. So you would think that given all of those things, there could be mass civil unrest after the election.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned earlier, I think that most of the population is still relatively apathetic. I think that most people assume fraud is occurring. And I had earlier mentioned the WikiLeaks and the fraud that's been revealed that the Democratic National Party had been engaged in, and Hilary Clinton's rather extensive history of sordid behavior. All of those facts have come out, and yet people, even in the Sanders campaign, and now we know that there was deliberate action on the part of the DNC to marginalize Sanders and undermine his potential to be nominated. No one really reacted that harshly to it. I think most people assume this is happening and they just are at the point where they don't care. They think that politics is always corrupt, that the media is lying. But as long as they can make ends meet, then now I'm returning to materialism and when we talked about the theory of communist revolution.
Yeah.
As long as people are able to make it from day to day, I don't think they're going to become mobilized around any political project, whether there was voter fraud or anything like that. Now, terrorism's another issue, though.
That swings everything, doesn't it? The bloodlust goes mental after that point, doesn't it?
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's more instructive when you look at Europe and what's happening in France in particular with the Front National and Marine Le Pen and all of that. And even UKIP in the UK. There we're seeing people starting to react politically against ISIS and the refugee crisis and all of that. It's more instructive and you're seeing more of a reaction than you are in the United States.
Sure. And then all you just need is a financial crisis as well. I mean, we just keep on throwing and this isn't conspiracy theory. This is things that with some degree of probability will happen within this year, wouldn't they?
Yeah. I mean, once we get into the economics of it all, if you add that on to lack of faith in political institutions, the terrorist threat, and then an economic collapse again, then I think we would see mass discontent, mobilization. The potential for civil unrest would increase exponentially.
In theory, when that sort of thing happens, do people usually just stick behind the old rulers, or does it all just turn into chaos and then you get all these other bubbling sort of celebrity types that start to come into the fray? Or what do you think it is at that point that starts to take over?
Well, once the objective conditions are that dire, how the subjective factors play out, it varies. It depends a lot. But I think that what you encounter is a legitimation crisis amongst the status quo, and that affects the political parties in particular. So if we get to the point where there's unemployment and savings are wiped out or any sort of economic unrest, then the old arguments are no longer going to be persuasive to people, and they're going to start looking for answers elsewhere. Now, what happens there is contingent upon what forces are organized and have a basis of support in the population.
So we've got some kind of scenario here where if the voting is deemed as rigged, we have a financial crisis, which is going to happen, but it depends on when. At the same point, and then if you have some kind of terrorism attack as well, which they're happening all the time now, you've got all the perfect recipe for a civil war, haven't you?
Yeah, you do. I think that as things stand now, especially when I examine Europe, I think the political orientation that would benefit most from this situation would be some kind of far-right nationalist, quasi-fascist movement. All of the factors are there that would support that. The left in much of Europe is discredited and weak, and it hasn't really...
It's turned to the elites, isn't it, really? That's all it's happened.
Like most people, I mean, especially when we're talking about the left wing of capital, like the Social Democratic parties or the Democratic Party in the United States, people associate all of that with the ruling class anyway, and therefore it wouldn't really speak to them. But then when you get down to parties that are ostensibly Marxist or at least to some form of communist organization, they're so distracted with identity politics and things of that sort. And when I say identity politics, I mean fringe identities like
transgender and stuff like that.
Yeah. Where the fascists are also engaged in identity politics, but it's surrounding the majority identity of the population. So British nationals or French nationals or white Americans, those are the majority population. So when you play identity politics with those groups, you're starting to get significant political power.
Yeah, which Donald Trump is playing to anyway.
He is, yeah. He definitely is. Whether he's sincere or not is another question.
Let's go into the future here, okay? Let's just say that we've got all the recipes of a situation of a total chaos amongst the administration and everything else. Where would that lie then at that point? The way I think of America sometimes is I think it's sometimes very self-resourceful. People just get on with their own processes and do their own things, or is it just too much tied up in the network of the monetary system that, like, cities would be destroyed almost? Well, not destroyed, but just go into it of chaos after that.
Yeah, it would be, in this country, it'd be very difficult to maintain any sort of semblance of normality in those conditions. If you go to a country like Greece right now, which is suffering from a really horrible economic crisis, they have managed to, even though there's a humanitarian crisis there, they still have been able to react in a manner by which they're able to organize resources that they can get by. But in Greece, it's a homogeneous population. It's a small country. It's easier to rely upon those networks. The United States...
They export more probably than they import, I'd imagine, as well.
Yeah, they have plenty of agriculture. Like, they can feed themselves at the very least, even if it's much more difficult now than it had been.
Yeah.
The United States, I mean, we have a very dramatic cleavage between the urban centers and then the agrarian communities. there's very little social trust. We're a very individualistic society. It would be harder to rely on those same reactions.
Yeah, that's an interesting point as well. And then all you've got really after that point is if you've got a discredited media, you've got conspiracy theorist media or the alternative media. That's like, there's no direction there, is there? After that, that's all there's all like, I guess you got a libertarian sort of vibe, which could probably kick off a little bit. I don't know whether that's council communism or whether that's just the anarcho-capitalism or anything like that. I don't know whether that's a big enough thing to kick off at that point, but it's well, you've got so much of a massive military. I don't know how the power would kick off again in some weird way or some kind of fashion.
Yeah, what would happen, I think, is you'd have some kind of cosmetic change amongst the ruling elites of the political establishment, but it would look like there was some kind of significant change happening on the surface, enough that they could maintain order in this context. I think that the radical organizations, whether it be on the right or the left, they're so small and disorganized right now in this country that they couldn't really take advantage of that situation the way you would imagine they could.
So I think we've gone down like some very sinister paths. Let's just say, for example, even just like Hillary Clinton wins, all right? And she's, I don't know, got a 7-point lead in the polls. You've still got a very disenchanted population, haven't you? You've got terrorism potentially still, and you've got economic crisis coming around the corner as well. So where does that end up under the Hillary administration?
I think it would be a similar situation as to a Trump scenario or any others. I think that if Clinton presides over another economic crisis similar to the one in 2008 or even larger in scale, then I think the population is going to, whoever, and mind you, in the United States, we have a very low voting turnout. Most people don't vote in this country. Yeah. Only a relatively small percentage of people vote. If the economic crisis is especially grinding, it's hard for me to predict what would come of that. If it's not, if it's bad, but if unemployment is contained to some extent, then I think they'd react by voting in a Republican the next time around. It would be something, it really depends on how severe the crisis is and how much it affects ordinary people.
Well, it's like there's no more powder in, like, there's no gunpowder left, is there really now? You've got interest rates down to well, what is it? It's like 0 point something now. They want to go into negative interests.
Yeah.
Can you afford to bail out the banks? I mean, obviously you could do if you wanted to, but you're going to destroy the purchasing power of the people. And the purchasing, and it's not like they're fully employed or anything like that. Like a lot of families, I mean, are they living mostly week to week, aren't they, really? So
yeah,
if you shoot up the prices of all your goods in the shopping stores, then you've got no real comeback from that, haven't you? You've got almost like the destruction of the cities at that point. People just go out to the farmlands to search for work.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that in the scenario of another economic crisis, I don't think it's politically viable to bail out the banks again. I think what would happen...
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, ignoring the risk of inflation, I just think that they wouldn't want to anger the population to that extent again. So what they would do is they would sort of engage in trust busting. They would break up the banks. And then as things progressed, you'd see another conglomeration of mega financial institutions. But for the time being, they would just let a lot of banks fail, and they would try to make it seem like
let's just say that we're some administration now and stuff like that, and we just want to kick the can down the road. Like they're all linguists up there. They use the words like quantitativizing, and then it takes us like a couple of years to work out what's actually going on. But we'll just work out something else. We'll just say, okay, there's a financial crisis. Remember, there's there's a bit more of a connection between the governments and the major banks as well at the moment. And obviously with the central banks, with the Federal Reserve, and there was TARPs funding where everyone got money just to keep themselves liquid for a certain period of time. Mm-hmm. You could almost, I don't know how the power of the government budgets are and stuff like that, but you could say that there could be still very secretive ways or manipulative ways to still bail out the banks to keep them afloat, just to kick the can down the road at levels.
Yeah, I think that would be the first reaction politicians would have because of how entrenched finance capital is with the political establishment right now.
Yeah, so that they would have to go down that route. But then if it gets to a point where literally you've got systematic financial crisis, so like two major banks you could see that are probably going to get a little bit go to the wayside is like your Deutsche Banks and the HSBC. I know Deutsche Banks got involved in something called a cocoa bond, where if they can't pay off their debts, they give them the debtors their shares. But if you'll see Deutsche Bank share price, it's just collapsing at the moment. So, and banks use share price as collateral for funding as well. So that bank's just going to the wayside right now. And obviously it's Germany's biggest bank. So you've got all of these banks. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can, even if you're protecting American banks, something happens from outside of the scope and it's so connected, it's like a domino effect. And you got things like central clearing houses that if one of the counterparties fail, then the insurance policy will kick in and pay off if there was a loss on all the positions of the trades. But still, you've got a situation where you can only bail out one. You can't bail out a major bank, is just chaos. But if you can bail out a medium bank, potentially you could get away with it. But foreign banks, massive bank as well, I don't think politicians can handle a situation like that.
No, they couldn't. And I'm inclined to think that they would either have to allow some of these institutions to fail, and they would start with the smaller, less politically powerful ones, obviously. And then either they would have to start implementing financial reforms that would temporarily they could restore Glass-Steagall, they could engage in antitrust legislation, anything to sort of make these financial firms smaller and easier to control. But
the thing is, though, it's we're thinking, what I'm thinking right now is I'm thinking in terms of just some Mitt Romney character, somebody that you couldn't get really angry with or something like that doing this sort of policy. But this is Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. This is imagine them two people making decisions like that. Everyone gets angry straight away, I'd imagine.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Those are the worst politicians conceivable to have faced such a scenario.
Yeah.
But then it sort of reduces to what one thinks the cause of crisis is, and that will have implications for how one gets out of a crisis. A lot of people, I don't know if you've ever studied modern monetary theory.
I might know a bit of it.
Yeah, it's a rather new paradigm. There's a few economists that are working within it. I think it was Steve Keen. He's an Australian economist.
One of my favorites, yeah.
Yeah, Steve Keen. Michael Hudson is an American economist that works within that paradigm. They're of the opinion that what you have to do, and one is more radical than the other in terms of their policy prescriptions, but they both agree that as opposed to bailing out financial institutions, what you have to do is just write off debts entirely.
Bail out personal debts and then give the individuals, Mm-hmm. Oh, we think so alike here, Michael, I know.
Out of the two, I think Trump would be more amenable to that sort of a approach, whereas Clinton would try the old bailout strategy.
She's been funded too much by the big corporates, hasn't she, really? I don't think she's paid for.
And Trump has more of an antagonistic view of finance because he was involved in real estate and he's been dealing with those institutions for a long time. So he has a negative perspective when it comes to finance.
I was just thinking of a theory here, right? You know, we've like America's found themselves in this position of like, my gosh, I can't believe it. We've got Hillary Clinton and we've got Donald Trump. I almost think some people think in a subliminal sense that they say, look, we need to let this happen. Let the bloody system collapse, because like we continue this on anymore, my children haven't got any future or anything like that. There's something a little bit weird sometimes with people where they like to put in dodgy characters into a situation just to let the system collapse itself. Do you know where I'm going here? Like, it's just, it's like, well, you could say Donald Trump's a populist to a certain extent, but then there is something like definite things where you think, okay, well, but he's not for this new age of peace around the world or anything like that. He's more like a bit of an aggressor. So it's not like he's like the model candidate where you could say President Obama is, in a way, where he's trying to promise everything to the world, but and never quite delivering, I guess, to a degree. But yeah, so so it's almost like people just say, I'm gonna cast my fuck you vote to the system, really, and that's what it's going to be, and therefore you get a situation like Hillary Clinton. Well, Hillary Clinton, I don't even think is like an up yours vote. It's just, she's sort of it was really the up yours vote was Bernie Sanders, but Hillary Clinton sort of got it for herself in with the super delegates and making sure that they had that's where the power was to be nominated. So so the best way to say up yours to that is bring in Donald Trump, who shoots his mouth off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think there's something to be said for that impulse. Now, I think what we're seeing right now is just people are they're so disillusioned with the status quo that they are wanting, a lot of them are voting in the fuck you direction with Donald Trump because regardless of whether he's sincere or not, his rhetoric is such, and he's caused such a commotion amongst the political establishment that it seems like he's the guy to go for if you just want to sort of shake things up. You're tired of the status quo. You don't think anything's being changed. You want to see change, whether it be good or bad. You just want something different to happen.
Yeah, crash the system, whatever it takes. Just we want a fresh start. Yeah,
exactly. Now, I think that the percent of the population that is feeling that way in relative terms is small. I think there's still enough people that are relatively satisfied with the status quo in the United States that Clinton will likely win in a legitimate election scenario. So even ignoring the possibility for election fraud, which I'm still dubious about, I don't know if they would even go that far. I think she has enough support by people that are relatively okay that she'd win the popular vote and the electoral vote.
Just incidentally, are you in a Democrat area or a Republican area?
I'm in a swing state, so Florida can go either way. Where I happen to live at the moment, this county is very Republican.
Okay,
but the state itself can go either way.
Right. Okay, interesting. Sorry, was this? I interrupted you there. Was there anything else you was going to add to that?
No. I just think that once things deteriorate more economically, then we'll see more radical sentiments being expressed by people, and it can go in any direction at that point. It's just a matter of who can capitalize on it. But for the moment, the people who are the most upset with the status quo, they're the ones voting for Trump. I think numerically speaking, are small enough that Clinton would win in this scenario.
All right. I think we'll just wrap things up there. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Michael, on those political aspects and the conspiracy. I do understand that you don't necessarily like to go down the route of total tinfoil hats and things like that, but I think we've made that political analysis fairly reasonable, would you say?
Yeah, I agree, Charles. Thank you for having me again. Just to sort of eliminate any ambiguity amongst listeners, if you've listened to our past podcasts, you know that I'm a materialist in terms of my analysis. I think ultimately the course of history is determined by the economic laws that are operating in any given society. But I am interested in conspiracy theories. I'm interested in the logic behind them. Sometimes a lot of the conspiratorial narratives do have a basis in fact. So that's why I tend to research them when I can. It's just purely intellectual curiosity.
Sure. I mean, I guess, with the conspiracy theory, it's a bad... Like, as soon as you say conspiracy theory, everyone goes, you're a weirdo or anything like that straight away, don't they? So but it's really just inquiry, isn't it, really? That's all it is. I'm curious about a subject, but for some reason, we've got this very funny word that just gets thrown out there straight away as soon as you have a line of inquiry, which is a little bit strange and goes into something which has got power connections and things like that. It's very strange, isn't it? Almost like if you could have a different word that has a totally different connotation to it, almost like even truther sounds a bit weird as well, doesn't it? But just somebody who, in general, who likes to inquire about things, somebody who's naturally curious. That's all it is, really, isn't it? After a while, but I guess the step is that once you start to get detached from reality, and then it starts to become pointless, like we say with the flat earthers. Like, it just gets to a point where you're wasting 20 years of your life into something that's never going to have any kind of impact on your own life. Then it's pointless. Yeah. But I think a lot of this stuff is fairly relevant to our life. So it's the way our society is structured.
Yeah, and I should also say that not everything that's labeled a conspiracy theory is legitimately a conspiracy theory. I think that, Marxists are sometimes accused of being conspiracy theorists, where when they call us class reductionists, they think that they accuse us of claiming the bourgeoisie is conspiring to suppress the proletariat. That has nothing to do with it. And likewise with many other narratives, they're not always conspiracy theories. The question is whether one believes that the course of history is determined by small elites conspiring with one another, or if there are structural factors at play. Now, since I'm a materialist, I think that it's ultimately the economic foundation that's determining it. But there's agents that are involved here, and they have power interests, and they sometimes do conspire with one another to serve the interests of maintaining their power or augmenting it in some sense. So, I don't consider that conspiratorial thinking, though, to acknowledge that fact. But other people would. People, like you said, there's people that are going to accuse you of being a conspiracy theorist no matter what you say, if it just sounds odd to them.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I think that's I think everyone really should, if you could say in a word, be a conspiracy theorist, but not to be too much of a conspiracy theorist. But there's nothing wrong with being curious and take it and getting objective views to something. It's not necessary. The whole basis of our conversations here, we're totally opposite people in a lot of ways in terms of our economic views of how the society would be structured. Yeah, like there's a lot of areas we're agreeing on as well. So it's
right.
This is the stuff that pushes people forward more than anything else, to get objective views rather than just having just one narrative.
Right, I agree. I think if I could frame it in a single term, I would say that people should engage in critical thinking more often, and we'd be better off. Yeah.
All right, Michael. Thank you very much. And as always, they can contact you at
commonruin.wordpress.com, or if they have a specific question, they can always email me at michaelacuña1987@yahoo.com.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Michael.
All right. Thank you, Charles.